saw more than a light. They saw a huge object that looked like the fuselage of a B-29. When the co-pilot had recovered, he looked out his side window to see if he could see the UFO, and there it was, flying formation with them. He yelled at the pilot, who leaned over and looked just in time to see the UFO disappear. The second look confirmed the mid-continent crew's first impression. The object looked like a B-29 without wings. They saw nothing more, only a big shadowy shape and the bluish-white light. The tower had missed the incident because they were landing the other airplane, and the pilot and the co-pilot didn't have time to call them and tell them about what was going on. All the tower operators could say was that seconds after the UFO had disappeared, the light that they had seen was gone. When the airliner landed in Omaha, the crew filed a report that was forwarded to the Air Force. But this wasn't the only report that was filed. A full colonel from military intelligence had been a passenger on the DC-3. He'd seen the UFO too, and he was mighty impressed. I thought that this was an interesting report, and I wondered what the official reaction would be. The official reaction was a great, big, deep belly laugh. This puzzled me because I'd read that the Air Force was seriously investigating all UFO reports. I continued to eavesdrop on the discussions about the report all day since the UFO expert was about to investigate the incident. He sent out a wire to flight service and found that there was a B-36 somewhere in the area of Sioux City at the time of the sighting, and from what I could gather, he was trying to blame the sighting on the B-36. When Washington called to get the results of the analysis of the sighting, they must have gotten the B-36 treatment because the case was closed. I'd only been at ATIC 2 days, and I certainly didn't class myself as an intelligence expert, but it didn't take an expert to see that a B-36, even one piloted by an experienced idiot, could not do what the UFO had done, buzz a DC-3 that was in an airport traffic pattern. I didn't know it at the time, but a similar event had occurred the year before. On the night of May 29, 1950, the crew of an American Airlines DC-6 had just taken off from Washington National Airport, and they were about 7 miles west of Mount Vernon when the co-pilot suddenly looked out and yelled, "Watch it! Watch it!" The pilot and the engineer looked out to see a bluish-white light closing in on them from dead ahead. The pilot racked the DC-6 up in a tight right turn while the UFO passed by on the left from 11 to 7 o'clock and a little higher than the airliner. During this time, the UFO passed between the full moon and the DC-6, and the crew could see the dark silhouette of a wingless B-29. Its length was about half the diameter of the full moon, and it had a blue flame shooting out the tail end. Seconds after the UFO had passed by the DC-6, the co-pilot looked out, and there it was again, apparently flying formation off their right wing. Then, in a flash of blue flame, it was gone, streaking out ahead of the airliner and making a left turn toward the coast. The pilot of the DC-6, who made the report, had better than 15,000 hours flying time. I didn't hear anything about UFOs or flying saucers, as they were then known, for several weeks, but I kept them in mind, and one day I asked one of the old hands at ATIC about them. Specifically, I wanted to know about the Sioux City incident. Why had it been sloughed off so lightly? His answer was typical of the official policy at that time. "One of these days, all of these crazy pilots will kill themselves. The crazy people on the ground will be locked up, and there won't be any more flying saucer reports." But after I knew the people at ATIC a little better, I found that being anti-saucer wasn't a unanimous feeling. Some of the intelligence officers took the UFO report seriously. One man, who had been on Project Sign since it was organized back in 1947, was convinced that the UFOs were interplanetary spaceships. He had questioned the people in the control tower at Godman Air Force Base when Captain Mantell was killed chasing the UFO, and he had spent hours talking to the crew of the DC-3 that was buzzed near Montgomery, Alabama, by a cigar-shaped UFO that spouted blue flame. In essence, he knew UFO history from A to Z because he had been there. I think that it was this controversial thinking that first aroused my interest in the subject of UFOs and led me to try to sound out a few more people. The one thing that stood out to me, being unindoctrinated in the ways of UFO lore, was the schizophrenic approach so many people at ATIC took. On the surface, they sided with the belly laughers on any saucer issue, but if you were alone with them and started to ridicule the subject, they defended it, or at least took an active interest. I learned this one day after I'd been at ATIC about a month. A belated UFO report had come in from Africa. One of my friends was reading it, so I asked him if I could take a look at it when he had finished. In a few minutes, he handed it to me. When I finished with the report, I tossed it back on my friend's desk with some comment about the whole world's being nuts. I got a reaction I didn't expect. He wasn't so sure the whole world was nuts. Maybe the nuts were at ATIC. "What's the deal?" I asked him. "Have they really thoroughly checked out every report and found that there's nothing to any of them?" He told me that he didn't think so. He'd been at ATIC a long time. He hadn't ever worked on the UFO project, but he had seen many of their reports and knew what they were doing. He just plain didn't buy a lot of their explanations. "And I'm not the only one who thinks this," he added. "Then why all of the big show of power against the UFO? The powers that be are anti-flying saucer," he answered, about half bitterly. "And to stay in favor, it behooves one to follow suit." As of February 1951, this was the UFO project. The words flying saucer didn't come up again for a month or two. I'd forgotten all about the two words and was deeply engrossed in making an analysis of the performance of the MiG-15. The MiG had just begun to show up in Korea, and finding out more about it was a hot project. Then the words flying saucer drifted across the room once more. But this time, instead of belly laughter, there was a note of hysteria. It seems that a writer from Life magazine was doing some research on UFOs, and rumor had it that Life was thinking about doing a feature article. The writer had gone to the Office of Public Information in the Pentagon and had inquired about the current status of Project Grudge. To accommodate the writer, the OPI had sent a wire out to ATIC. "What is the status of Project Grudge?" Back went a snappy reply. "Everything is under control. Each new report is being thoroughly analyzed by our experts. Our vast files of reports are in tip-top shape, and in general, things are hunky-dunky. All UFO reports are hoaxes, hallucinations, and the misidentification of known objects." Another wire from Washington. "Fine. Mr. Bob Ginna of Life is leaving for Dayton. He wants to check some reports." Bedlam in the raw. Other magazines had printed UFO stories, and other reporters had visited ATIC, but they had always stayed in the offices of the top brass. For some reason, the name Life, the prospects of a feature story, and the feeling that this Bob Ginna was going to ask questions caused sweat to flow at ATIC. Ginna arrived and the ATIC UFO expert talked to him. Ginna later told me about the meeting. He had a long list of questions about reports that had been made over the past 4 years, and every time he asked a question, the expert would go tearing out of the room to try to find the file that had the answer. I remember that day people spent a lot of time ripping open bundles of files and pawing through them like a bunch of gophers. Many times, "I'm sorry, that's classified," got ATIC out of a tight spot. Ginna, I can assure you, was not at all impressed by the efficiently operating UFO project. People weren't buying the hoax, hallucination, and misidentification stories quite as readily as the Air Force believed. Where it started, or who started it, I don't know, but about 2 months after the visit from Life's representative, the official interest in UFOs began to pick up. Lieutenant Jerry Cummings, who had recently been recalled to active duty, took over the project. Lieutenant Cummings is the type of person who, when given a job to do, does it. In a few weeks, the operation of the UFO project had improved considerably, but the project was still operating under political, economic, and manpower difficulties. Cummings' desk was right across from mine, so I began to get a UFO indoctrination via bull sessions. Whenever Jerry found a good report in the pile, and all he had to start with was a pile of papers and files, he'd toss it over for me to read. Some of the reports were unimpressive, I remember, but a few were just the opposite. 2 that I remember Jerry showing me made me wonder how the UFOs could be sloughed off so lightly. The 2 reports involved movies taken by Air Force technicians at White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. The guided missile test range at White Sands is fully instrumented to track high, fast-moving objects, the guided missiles. Located over an area of many square miles, there are camera stations equipped with cinetheodolite cameras and linked together by a telephone system. On April 27, 1950, a guided missile had been fired, and as it roared up into the stratosphere and fell back to Earth, the camera crews had recorded its flight. All the crews had started to unload their cameras when one of them spotted an object streaking across the sky. By April 1950, every person at White Sands was UFO conscious, so one member of the camera crew grabbed a telephone headset, alerted the other crews, and told them to get pictures. Unfortunately, only one camera had film in it. The rest had already been unloaded, and before they could reload, the UFO was gone. The photos from the one station showed only a smudgy, dark object. About all the film proved was that something was in the air, and whatever it was moving. Alerted by this first chance to get a UFO to run a measured course, the camera crews agreed to keep a sharper lookout. They also got the official okay to shoot a UFO if one appeared. Almost exactly a month later, another UFO did appear, or at least at the time the camera crews thought that it was a UFO.